So this next presentation, we'll be joined by Katrina Hoffman and the Prince William Sound Center, who are hosting a watch party right now in Cordova. And are we ready to switch over? Okay, great.
This was a small community tucked in between Chugach and Tlingit territory. I know a lot of folks who recreate in Western Prince William Sound rarely make it this far over. But if you've been to our hamlet, it's the easternmost community on Prince William Sound. And if you spent any time in Cordova, you probably found it to be a welcoming, creative, resourceful, outdoorsy fishing community full of people with a lot of skill and talent. And although many of you are familiar with the region, I am going to give a little background in case there are folks in the room or online who are coming from a different perspective, talking about why the Science Center works to build an understanding of our home and help it continue to be a more resilient place. So just checking in, did the slide change for you over there on the Whittier side? Sounds like A-okay. So if you're crossing Prince William Sound by vessel, you round Salmo Point, you come down this channel, which is Orca Inlet. And it's a very shallow inlet, and almost in the exact center of this photograph, you can make out this white modeling on the shoreline. That is Cordova on the water's edge, just below Mount Eyak and just west of Eyak Lake. This is a photograph that I took from an Alaska Airlines jet. Some of you may know this, but Cordova is home port to more commercial fishing vessels than any other harbor in Alaska. There are other towns that land more pounds of fish, but the places that are landing the most fish, like on Alaska, Dutch Harbor, those vessels are typically home ported in Seattle. Cordova's home to almost 600 fishing vessels. And so a significant percentage of the households in our community are invested or involved or affected by the commercial salmon fishing industry. And a lot of our work is related to that as well. So the livelihoods of people in this community, as well as the native villages and other communities around Prince William Sound, really depend on access to healthy, abundant natural resources. And the region's really been that way since before recorded colonial history. I like to say, if you put a pin in a map, I challenge you to find another place with more diverse ecosystems within a 100-mile radius. Put that pin right on Cordova. And within that 100-mile radius, you get the Bering Glacier and Bagley ice field. That's the world's most extensive ice field outside of Greenland that's not on a polar ice cap. Sound contains the largest surging glacier on Earth. We've got a pristine, temperate coastal rainforest that's the size of some East Coast states. 700,000 acre Copper River Delta. It's the largest wetland complex on the Pacific coast of North America, the world's primary nesting location for dusky geese. We're surrounded by these awesome Chugach Mountains, which provide a lot of resources and recreation. And you know, just to our north, the Wrangell Mountains, where that Copper River ends up, are flanked by boreal forests that are almost desert-like compared to what's going down here in coastal Alaska. And those boreal forests store about twice as much carbon as tropical forests, which is another fact that most of us don't learn in elementary school. Here in Cordova, we get about 150 inches of precipitation a year in town, competing with Whittier for bad weather. And, you know, that we're just hemmed in by some mountains that really like to funnel that in. And at the Science Center and our community in general, even our Chamber of Commerce has adopted this language. We like to call this the home of the world's richest waters. It is at the northernmost extent of the coastal temperate rainforest, but it's also the northernmost extent of something else, the global ocean conveyor belt. This conveyor belt, basically, if you've ever seen that movie, Finding Nemo, you know that there's, you know, bodies of water in the ocean that are currents that move almost like rivers within a larger body of water. And the global ocean conveyor belt, it spends about 1,000 years moving through the world's oceans, starting out down near Antarctica, before it daylights here in the North Pacific, in the Gulf of Alaska, just outside Prince William Sound. That water has been collecting marine snow, detritus. It's really cold. Colder water can hold more dissolved gases and nutrients. And as it daylights here, it upwells. It's bringing those nutrients with it that support things like plankton, that phytoplankton that are going to do photosynthesis. And really, the fact that the global ocean conveyor belt daylights in the North Pacific is one of the main things that contributes to the incredible productivity of Alaska's oceans, that seafood productivity that generates 60% of the seafood produced in the United States. So I love looking at satellite photos like this one from NASA. You can practically see how biology and geology and chemistry are mixing to create this really diverse landscape. And in a fishing year, you know, Cordova typically lands itself in the top 20 ports by ex-vessel value in the United States. Here's another look at some watersheds, and all of those things in the orange and rust and peach colors are kind of what we think of as our bioregion or our backyard. Prince William Sound, the Copper River and Bering River watersheds, Prince William Sound itself having over 3,800 miles of shoreline, that Copper River watershed being about the size of West Virginia. If you're a bird nerd or would like to become one, I encourage you to come to the Copper River Delta Shorebird Festival. It was last weekend, but it'll be back in future years, and so will the birds. It's a wonderful experience. There are about 16 million birds and waterfowl that move through this area annually. Over 235 species of bird have been identified. 20 of them are species of special conservation concern. So this delta experiences about 16 million migrating shorebirds annually. 16 million birds annually. 42 of those are shorebird species. It's pretty much used by almost the entire population of Western sandpipers on Earth. It's home to the world's largest population of nesting trumpeter swans. The Copper River system itself has 5 salmonid species: Chinook, coho, sockeye, steelhead, cutthroat. And then Prince William Sound is this really complex embayment series of fjords, islands, glaciers terminating at sea level, complex shore zones and intertidal areas. And it's tends to be more dominated by pink and chum salmon, as well as supporting the presence of several hatcheries and 2 nonprofit hatchery corporations. Speaking of abundance and hatcheries, this is what pink and chum salmon look like when they come back to some of the creeks in Prince William Sound. These are some of our research technicians who were collecting otolith samples, the ear bones from fish, as well as heart tissue samples. The ear bones of fish that are released by hatcheries in Prince William Sound get marked with a code, like a barcode. You can pull that ear bone out of a fish, cut it, polish it, look at it under a microscope, and know which hatchery it came from. We also collected heart tissue samples for genetics analysis by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. This was a study to investigate the interactions between hatchery salmon and natural origin salmon in creeks in Prince William Sound. That information continues to be analyzed to this day. We collected this data for about 8 years. ADF&G is using it, the hatcheries are using it, and the agency is still analyzing some of the data, especially the genetics data. The fisheries here in this region, the salmon fisheries, are certified as sustainable by the Marine Stewardship Council. However, information like this is being collected to optimize management practices and hatchery practices. And reminder that the hatcheries in Alaska don't rear fish to maturity. They release juvenile fish to the ocean to live as wild fish and compete against wild fish. We know from this study that hatchery fish and wild fish do tend to return to creeks at slightly different times, and they tend to prefer to spawn at slightly different reaches of the creeks. However, the way salmon get into different parts of the world is by migrating and moving, and sometimes not ending up where they're supposed to go. And so we also know from these studies that sometimes hatchery fish and wild fish are intermingling and mating And we know that because we did multiple generations of data collection, and we could pin a fish in one creek to its parents and grandparents in some cases, because we collected samples across several years. And in any given summer, we collected between 50 to 60,000 otoliths to advance this study. So we do know that the wild origin fish, in the places where they're intermingling to a greater degree with hatchery origin fish, experience an impact to their fitness. It decreases the genetic fitness of those wild origin fish. To what extent, it's hard to say. But again, this is an opportunity to continue doing more studies. So why do we do what we do? The Science Center's mission is to advance community resilience and the understanding and sustainable use of ecosystems. We approach all of our projects with the intent that they will result in positive impacts, in sustainable use of resources, and a more resilient region. We primarily do this through scientific research, STEM education, and applied science and demonstration projects. And I'll give several examples of those today. There's a lot more work going on than what I can tell you about in this slideshow. The word resilience sounds like a buzzword today, but it is truly critical to our region. It shows up in our mission language, and humans are egocentric, so it's easy to think of resilience in the context of what humans value. Essentially, it's the ability to adapt to pressure and change in a manner that allows a system to maintain recognizable structure and function. Systems, natural systems, ecosystems, they have processes and functions that generate certain conditions. And those conditions can support things that we value and use and are supported by or benefit from, or not. And how much disturbance an ecosystem can withstand before it gets into a new or different steady state varies. That new state can provide more benefits or fewer benefits over time as it pertains to what we care about. It's of no concern to the ecosystem if it's super productive of jellyfish or super productive of fish that we prefer to eat, but it's of value to us. And that's why the Science Center works to connect the dots between how humans operate in the world and the future state of natural systems that we want to support and participate in and benefit from. Our region's had to be resilient. It's withstood a lot of perturbations over time, from occupancy by settlers to the '64 earthquake. That remodeled a lot of systems in the Sound. Here in the eastern Prince William Sound, it uplifted the land more than 3 meters or 10 feet. It's one of the reasons why Orca Inlet is so shallow nowadays. For our fleet to get out to the Copper River Delta and the Gulf of Alaska, they actually mark a channel during fishing season. That's the one safe channel that most vessels can transit at most times. The razor clam fishery, Cordova was once the razor clam capital of the world, no longer. Probably multiple negative pressures involved there, including that uplift of the land, as well as some disease that we know occurs in clams. And then, as most of you know, Prince William Sound being the site of the largest oil spill in US history up until Deepwater Horizon happened. And the Exxon Valdez incident made it really clear that there's a fine balance that's achieved in places whose economies are supported by renewable natural resources, as well as non-renewable ones in the transportation of oil. And that balance and the natural systems of the area were understudied up until that time. The Science Center had been conceived of by a bunch of community leaders in 1986, and they had been getting together, having brown bag lunches. They actually were working up nonprofit papers because they felt that the ecosystems of this region were so meaningful that folks should be studying them. Then the spill happened, and we were incorporated a month later in 1989. And as you heard from some colleagues today, or will hear from some folks who are part of a large program called Gulf Watch Alaska, which the Science Center is heavily involved in. That program is the long-term monitoring program that studies the extent and status of recovery of the spill-affected ecosystem at many levels, many trophic levels. So, you know, you see the Exxon Valdez here kind of looming over some tugboats. And if you look in the back, in the center, there's an iceberg. in the water. And ironically, due to climate change, the icebergs that forced the mate to change course on that particular day no longer threaten these shipping lanes, although there are other threats to shipping safety, and that's why a really well-tuned ship escort system is used today. We've been involved in herring research for a long time. One of the potential lingering effects of the spill is the crash of the herring fishery. There is no causation that has been proven, but the correlation is strong enough that oil spill settlement monies have been spent on studying herring, and we've been deeply involved in that for a couple decades at this point. The 1989 Young of the Year fish did not make it to reproductive maturity, which is usually when they're about 3 years old. And, as it pertains to resilience, that subject or definition I was giving earlier, you have to wonder, has this herring population entered a new steady state that looks different than the one we used to benefit from more robustly? This is the longest sustained crash ever recorded in a herring population. Typically, when given an opportunity, fisheries will bounce back. This fishery has been experiencing other pressures. For a time, the humpback whale population was getting larger and healthier. As you heard from John Moran, that's not the case since the Pacific marine heat wave occurred, but there was more predation by whales for some time. There was also more disease in these fish. We're aware of different viral and fungal outbreaks that, once this fish population got pretty small, have probably contributed to keeping it suppressed. And the Science Center, also doing some energy studies, determined that a lot of these fish were not making it to a big enough size before their first winter. And they were starving and dying after their first winter or during their first winter. You have to have success in your first year if you're going to have ongoing success. And these fish are in an ocean that's being affected by more runoff from melting tidewater glaciers, as well as changing hydrology from some of the increasing rain events that we're seeing in the region. And that freshwater lens can create a layer in the ocean where things don't get to interact with each other as they might. Prey may not be found by predators as easily, etc. Those baby fish have been struggling. In any case, an economic comment on this herring fishery is that several years ago, the Science Center hired an economist to study the value of the loss of this fishery. And at this point, the value of the loss of the herring fishery by ex-vessel value exceeds $1 billion. Cordova had 40% of the permits in that herring fishery. There were several different types of fisheries. The next three highest permit holding communities, which were Valdez, Homer, and Seward, had 7%, 4%, and 3% of the permits. So in our town alone, there's been an unrealized loss of over $400 million in revenue in the last 35 years, which is significant. And that's one reason why it's been important for us to continue studying this fish. We do annual monitoring to help ADF&G update their population model and also keep track of the health of the population today. They have allowed, the population essentially right now is hovering right below a fishable level. And they have allowed a new bait fishery to proceed. But to date, the commercial fishery hasn't come back. And when it does, the markets don't exist anymore. And as we're experiencing in this growing mariculture industry in Prince William Sound, markets are really important. And if you don't have them, it can be really hard to pursue commercial activities around things. So how do we study what's going on in the ocean? We use humans and technology to collect data, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes asynchronously. We have a 39-foot vessel, the New Wave, which occasionally you may see tooling around the Sound. It's out there today. It has an A-frame on the aft deck that allows us to deploy and retrieve instrumentation. And we occasionally charter other vessels, including commercial fishing vessels, when we need a different configuration for staff, equipment, or the type of research we're doing for any given project. And also, this vessel is pretty heavily subscribed to. We maintain weather buoys in Port Valdez on behalf of the Prince William Sound RCAC, and we regularly have other work going on. So this is our oceanographer, Dr. Rob Campbell. He's also our chief science officer. He's just done a net tow, grabbing some zooplankton samples. Zooplankton is that second level of productivity in the ocean, little critters that look kind of like bugs. Most of them are microscopic. Not all plankton is microscopic. And they help us track when the spring bloom is happening. And that spring bloom is really important to fisheries productivity. As I mentioned, the vessels out there today, they're doing some plankton tows as well as some bird and mammal sample observations regarding some mariculture work that I'll get into later. So they bring those samples back to the lab, and we use microscopes to count plankton. And we can track trends over time. And one trend we were able to identify was the impact of the Pacific marine heat wave. Those skinny California plankton that I saw John Moran telling you about earlier, as compared to what we usually see and what is more effective in terms of transfer of energy in this ecosystem, those really lipid-rich, fatty, cold water plankton that are more common here. And those cold water plankton were hard to come by in Pacific marine heat wave years, and it had cascading effects in the ecosystem. In any case, research vessels are really expensive to operate, and folks can't afford to be out there 365 days a year. And if we want to understand ocean ecosystems, we need to study them in other ways as well that complement those research vessel operations. So one way we do that is by deploying instrumentation like this AMP, the acoustic moored profiling device. This is moored in central Prince William Sound as I speak. It's near Naked Island. It gets moored for months at a time. We usually deploy it from about May to October. And we pull it out in the winter to calibrate the instruments, and also so it won't go on walkabout if a big winter storm hits and drags it on its anchor. This suite of instruments, there's actually quite a few instruments here. They collect a lot of the different types of information that oceanographers like to know about salinity, nutrients, light penetration, other information that helps them understand what's happening in the ocean. This one is anchored to the seafloor. It winches itself down to 60 meters and holds there, and it conducts 2 profiles to the surface daily, one in the daytime and one at night. Lots of things behave differently at night in the ocean, including zooplankton. It pierces the surface, and we can communicate with it via cell tower. If there's about to be a storm, we can tell it to stay down for 3 days so it doesn't come up on the surface and get hit or damaged by waves. And Dr. Campbell regularly returns to it to retrieve data, switch out batteries, and that sort of thing. This allows us to get really robust amounts of information about what's happening in the oceans in a way that ship-based oceanography typically does not do. So it's awesome. And that information is provided in the Alaska Ocean Data Portal. One of the instruments on that acoustic moored profiling device is a plankton camera. So Dr. Campbell worked with colleagues at Scripps Institute of Oceanography who developed these cameras. I believe we had serial number 6 on the plankton camera that was deployed on our moored profiling device. We were the first entity in Alaska to deploy a device like this. Since then, about a year or 2 ago, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, our colleagues, Seth Danielson and Russ Hopcroft and others got some funding, and they deployed one a little farther out in the Gulf of Alaska too. So there are now 2 profiling devices that operate in this way. In any case, we installed this plankton camera. We get awesome images of plankton. This camera is collecting terabytes of data, and look at how wonderful the resolution is. But OMG, terabytes of data would take a very long time for a person to analyze. So we're using now artificial intelligence and machine learning, not to put someone out of a job, but to get that data analyzed. And Dr. Campbell has trained a computer to identify the top 46 species of zooplankton. And we can analyze this information much more rapidly using computing power. By the way, if you've ever swallowed a mouthful of seawater, you've probably eaten a copepod. They are most likely the most abundant animals on Earth. Some of the critters we work with are a little more charismatic than plankton. This is an aerial view of Middleton Island out in the Gulf of Alaska. where our staff and collaborators from UAF spent a couple summers recently tagging tufted puffins. Tufted puffins have really wonderful sight fidelity to their nests. So you can go back with a little nest camera, poke that camera into the hole in the ground where the puffins nest, determine whether or not your bird is there. And we attached geolocator tags to these birds. Very little is known about where tufted puffins go in the winter when they're not breeding, and they've recently become a species of concern. It appears that their population is starting to decline. So from 2018 through to 2020, we tagged and retrieved geolocator devices from these birds, and we had really good resighting efforts. Over 90% of the birds were resighted. Retrieve that geolocator. It uses light level activity to convert to latitude and longitude, and you can determine where these birds are spending time. So the blue dots, the red dots are nests that were being monitored, and the blue ones are nests where a puffin was successfully tagged with a geolocator. And you can see the size of the tag in the image on the left. They're pretty small. This is our research technician, Anne Schaefer, taking measurements on a tufted puffin. They collected blood and feather samples. They're learning more about their diet and health condition through analysis of those samples as well. And they did publish a paper describing for the first time where these birds are spending their winter, often farther east in the Gulf of Alaska, with the males and females kind of segregating out where they spend their time in winter. And if you'd like a link to that paper, one can be provided. The authors are Schaefer, Bishop, and Gorman. And we, in terms of bird research, other types of work we do, we've had a sentinel study site for several years, working with colleagues in New England at MIT and Tufts University and the University of Massachusetts to monitor for avian influenza. Just like in humans, there's always some level of influenza, typically circulating in bird populations. And for this work, which is funded by the National Institutes of Health, we collect gull eggs, bird stool samples, and blood. And there is an avian influenza outbreak in the US right now. Also, 2 summers ago, a state lab confirmed that a bald eagle that was ill in Cordova was positive for avian influenza. But ultimately, you know, we also know that zoonotic diseases can be transferred sometimes between different species and sometimes between animals and humans. And so some of this work is monitoring work to establish a baseline understanding of what is that natural background level of influenza in bird populations versus when there's an outbreak. And further, Alaska is close to Asia, and so there are birds that transit between continents, and it's also useful to study avian influenza for that reason if there's an outbreak in another part of the world that gets transferred over here. We do a lot of fisheries population research as well. You may not know this, but we're part of the Global Ocean Tracking Network, and we have curtained off the entrances to Prince William Sound with acoustic arrays. What does that mean? Where you see those red marks on this map, we have acoustic receivers, which are little listening devices that are anchored to the seafloor. We're using these for fisheries studies, and we've learned that the fish that we typically study really like to go closer to the islands. So most of our arrays are over near the islands, and you can actually stagger how you deploy those receivers. So they're basically gated. A fish may swim past one first, and then the next one shows you directionality of movement. Are they coming into the sound or going out of the sound? We've deployed these to study the herring population, and we've learned, and we've actually deployed them in some of the embayments farther north in the fjords like Port Gravina. We've learned that some populations of herring prefer to stay in their bay or in the sound year round, whereas others transit out into the ocean. And that may confer different levels of success depending on where there might be ecosystem stressors. So this is maybe a good way of spreading out risk for the populations. We primarily studied herring this way. We've also studied lingcod. We are looking for funding to study pollock and maybe even things like halibut. The nice thing is that if a researcher anywhere in the world has tagged an organism with an acoustic transmitter, a little pinger, and they swim past this array, we can provide them with that data. And so we go back and we retrieve the receivers and we gather the data from them annually. and it allows us to understand things about populations and also share information with other people. There are folks from Stanford who've been studying sharks in Prince William Sound. We give them data about the organisms they've tagged, et cetera. And to do that, the transmitters are really small. You know, to implant, we do live surgery on herring. We put them under anesthesia. That little transmitter is like the size of my pinky fingernail. We let them recover post-surgery, and then we release them to the environment. And after one major release of quite a few fish, we detected 94% of the tagged fish on the array, meaning that they recovered well enough from the surgery to start swimming in the ocean and be picked up on this array. Mind you, those pingers have batteries in them, and the battery only lasts a certain amount of time. So you're not tracking the location of an organism forever, just until that battery dies, unless you have much larger organism and the type of transmitter that can pop up and tell a satellite where it is or information about that organism's life history. In any way, this is what the receiver looks like. It's that thing, a little like black cylinder on the end of the line that Brad is deploying. So pretty interesting stuff. Other fisheries work we've done, working to help the management agency, ADF&G, and the fishing industry. So back in 2012, there was a lot of ice and snow up in the Copper River. Late breakup, the agency kept the fishery closed for the first 3 weeks of the season, which you can imagine the commercial fleet kind of went batty over. Those are the 3 highest value weeks of the season. And the Copper River is the first commercial salmon fishery in Alaska. So there's an opportunity to make a lot of money at that time of year that then falls off. When they're counting fish up at Miles Lake, that red dot at the top of that image, that's like a 7-day swim time for the fish from where the fleet is allowed to fish in the ocean at the Barrier Islands at the mouth to the river. So the red dot that you see in the center of this image at the Martin River Cut Bank, we deployed an acoustic, a sonar array there to track fish, to count fish, and provide that information to ADF&G. And this work was funded by the commercial fisheries. The fleet funded it with the Science Center as that neutral third party. And we provided the data in near real time on a website to both ADF&G and the commercial fleet. And what we found over the course of 6 years is that at early season, we could, the counts that we did at this Martin River Cut Bank site correlated to what ADF&G would later see several days later at the Miles Lake sonar. And ADF&G did relay that they used some of that information in their decision making. If they make one opener versus a closure, this could be the difference of $1 million in revenue or not. And so we're showing ways that the agency can change some of their practices and update some of their practices to manage in the precautionary principle closer to near real time and closer in time and space to where fisheries need to happen. Let's see. We also, by the way, installed a camera weir at East Chamois in Western Prince William Sound 2 summers ago, and we taught a computer to analyze the data from the camera in real time, and we provided that information to ADF&G. It was a weir that they could no longer afford to support technicians at. So precautionarily, they kept that fishery closed because they weren't getting the data. We showed them that you can use cameras and artificial intelligence to identify fish to species, and you can use this information to better manage fisheries. Now the Native Village of Eyak technicians, who are partners of ours, are carrying on that work at East Chamois Weir. Size at age in Copper River fish has been changing over time. We have been tagging and tracking fish and collecting biometric data from them to better understand what's going on. And we have a new study launching this summer in collaboration with the Native Village of Eyak, ADF&G, Wrangell St. Elias National Park. There's lots of collaborators when you're doing work upriver. And then you can see this river. This is a dust storm where it's dumping this nutrient-rich dust from glaciers that have been grinding on rock, and it's being deposited into the Gulf of Alaska. And we did a study where we set these air sampling devices on Middleton Island, and we proved that some of the species of iron in this dust are biologically available. That means when this dust lands in the ocean, It's like an injection of fertilizer. It actually stokes phytoplankton blooms. So this is one of those amazing ways that the non-living world and living world are connected between ice grinding on rock, creating essentially fisheries productivity. And you can play it forward in your mind. What happens if those glaciers go away altogether and they're no longer grinding on that rock? If the timing or intensity of these dust storms changes, what effect will that have on fisheries productivity? We've been getting involved in mariculture research. A lot of people like to say it provides many benefits. Other people have concerns. No one's really studied it robustly in Alaska. So we are doing that with some of our colleagues. We are studying the effects on the pelagic ecosystem. How are farms providing things like refugia for fish? We're studying whether there are negative impacts on seabirds and marine mammals, and we're studying the oceanography of the areas around these farms. And this is a big study with a lot of partners. The Science Center is just one of them. We also are now permitted as a kelp hatchery. And so we just grew kelp last fall for 4 farms, including 3 commercial farms and 1 research farm belonging to the native village of Eyak. This is what that kelp looks like when it's growing out on seed lines. We learned a lot of lessons, and we're hoping to get some new equipment that will help us have an even better hatchery year this fall. We're the only running seawater hatchery on Prince William Sound. There's another one that trucks seawater to their containerized hatchery, and they provide seed string for their farms. We've been involved in energy research. So we have been studying the potential route for transmission lines between Valdez and Cordova, working with the National Renewable Energy Lab. And we've even provided them with data about ocean currents to evaluate marine hydrokinetic or tidal power potential. There is the best potential is out where that yellow line touches that island as it pertains to where power could be generated in a place that's relevant to Cordova. The FAA has a station out there, and they may actually be running a power line to Cordova anyway. And so that's a site that is being looked at for both solar photovoltaic potential, and then we've provided some of the data for marine hydrokinetic potential. And we don't do any of this in a vacuum. We do a lot of education programs with K through grade audiences, including working with every grade level in Cordova schools, but also taking that show on the road to other communities in Alaska. And some of them come here. For example, there was a homeschool group from the Chugach School District. Some Whittier kids have been in Cordova. They're coming home on the ferry yesterday or today, having a great time with our educators. We don't want this information to exist in a vacuum, and helping people understand how places work and how they're valuable helps them to be thoughtful citizens. Everyone in Alaska is not going to become a resource manager, but everyone in Alaska is a member of a community that relies on natural resources in one way or another. Love this quote from our colleague, Mark Blaine: "The doing of science is an inherently optimistic endeavor. Scientists often divorce themselves from the outcomes, but as a nonprofit entity, we're looking towards that vision of a future where communities continue to live in the balance with resilient ecosystems." And we've been changing over time too. That's our old building, humble roots. It was an ice house, it was a cannery, it was a machine shop. Then it became a science center. We outgrew that spot. And so now we're in our new home. We just finished building a $25 million campus here in Cordova. We are now the 3rd building in Alaska to be primarily heated by energy from the ocean. We have running seawater laboratories, we have a kelp hatchery, we have a seawater heat pump, and soon we will be having exhibits designed and constructed, and we'll have a touch tank in our atrium. So we're excited to continue doing good work in the region. If you'd like to know more, you can go to our website, pwssc.org, and later this week, we'll be publishing our annual report that will have links to some of our publications from 2023. We also have an annual natural history newspaper called Delta Sound Connections. You might be able to pick it up at the ferry terminal in Whittier. It's definitely at the Begich Boggs Visitor Center. And that publishes articles for lay audiences, not just about the Science Center's work, but about the work of dozens of partners in the region. And it has really good information about what's going on. So I encourage you to get your hands on a copy of Delta Sound Connections. And if you like what we do, we're soft money funded. We welcome your support. You can also make donations on our website. And thanks for the time that you provided for me to share with you today.